Welcome, everyone. I'm Wesley Hogan, the director of the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled that you all are here with us. The center is co-sponsoring this event with the National Humanities Center, and Robert Newman and his team here at the National Humanities Center have tackled such an important project with this conference, and we're so grateful that film and the arts are central and not marginal to this work. Thanks so much to Robert, Heidi Camp, and Colleen O'Shea at Women Make Movies for making today possible. I'm so honored today to share space with Natalie Bullock Brown, Shalini, Kantayya, and Marsha Gordon. I'll do brief bios of these incredible women, and then we'll begin. Natalie Bullock Brown is someone who has had a huge influence on me since I came to North Carolina in 2013. She teaches documentary film at North Carolina State University and is herself a documentary filmmaker and editor. Her current project explores the white beauty standard and its impact on Black women and girls. She's also a producer for award-winning filmmaker Byron Hurt's upcoming PBS documentary, Hazing. She's a monthly contributor of pop cultural analysis on WUNC's radio program Back Channel on the State of Things. And she also serves as a strategist for Working Film's Story Shift initiative, developing praxis and best practices for ethical, accountable documentary storytelling. Marsha Gordon is professor of film studies at North Carolina State University, a recent fellow at the National Humanities Center, and an NEH public scholar. She's the author of numerous books and articles and director of several documentaries. She's currently completing a book about the once famous and now forgotten early 20th century writer Ursula Parrott and the reinvention of the modern woman. Filmmaker Shalini Kantayya's Coded Bias premiered at the 2020 Sundance Festival to critical acclaim. And Shalini put critical acclaim, but it was wild critical acclaim. Coded Bias was broadcast nationally on PBS Emmy Award-winning series Independent Lens and will stream globally on Netflix, or is streaming globally on Netflix currently. The film won a SEMA Award for Best Director and has been nominated for a Critics' Choice, a Cinema Eye Honors, and NAACP Image Award, among many others. Shalini's debut feature, Catching the Sun, from 2016, such an exciting film as well, premiered at the LA Film Festival and was named a New York Times Critics' Pick. Catching the Sun released globally on Netflix on Earth Day 2016. With executive producer Leonardo DiCaprio, and was nominated for the Environmental Media Association Award for Best Documentary. She directed the season finale of the National Geographic television series Breakthrough, executive produced by Ron Howard and broadcast globally in June 2017. She's also directed for Nova and YouTube Originals. Shalini is a TED Fellow, a William J. Fulbright Scholar, and an associate of the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. You can see why I'm so excited to be among these incredible people today. So I'm going to start off with a question for each of them, and then I'm going to ask them to ask questions of each other, and then we'll open it up to the group, all of you as a whole, to ask questions. So Natalie, welcome.
Thank you, Wesley.
Can you talk a little bit about your work with Story Shift and the process of creating our curatorial statement? And I'm just going to, for people who haven't had a chance to see it, I'm going to ask you to start with Story Shift because it's been so influential on me, and the process of wanting to work with you on the curation of this body of work for the series. But the curatorial statement I'll just read. So when you and I were working on these films for this conference, this is the curatorial statement we came up with. We're imagining a future that centers people who have traditionally been targeted and marginalized in artificial intelligence conversations. BIPOC people, women in particular, must have a seat at the table if we wish to imagine, strategize, and implement a more equitable AI present and future. When voices that have traditionally been excluded are at the table, a bubbling up of visions that are inclusive, rich, and profound emerge. We fully embrace sharing the space and power essential to shaping this future.
Okay, so thanks, Wesley, for reading that and also for the wonderful introductions. Welcome to all of you. I'm really pleased and honored to be a part of this esteemed panel. To honor Wesley's request, I'll talk a little bit about the work that I do with an organization based in Wilmington, North Carolina called Working Films, through which I have become a strategist for their program Story Shift. So Working Films has worked at the intersection of documentary and grassroots organizing for 20 years. In all aspects of the organization's work, it demonstrates a belief that it is essential to listen and respond to the needs of the communities most impacted by the issues Working Films works to address. Working Films believes this listening and responsiveness is necessary for storytellers too. And in recent years, there have been increasing conversations in the documentary sector about extractive media making and the need to mitigate that extraction and promote ethical, accountable storytelling. Story Shift is Working Films' contribution to that conversation. And so what we do through Story Shift is examine what true accountability and authentic representation can look like in documentary filmmaking. We strive to ask critical questions about who gets to tell whose story. And if a filmmaker tells a story that is not their own, how does that filmmaker move in a way that eliminates harm for the people who are featured in the film? We ask a lot of other questions that we definitely don't have all the answers for. And I also want to just lift up the fact that this is a conversation that's been going on for years. It's not something that Working Films created. It's not something that's really new, but in many ways, the racial reckoning of 2020 during the pandemic, and the racial reckoning was also really sort of a pandemic of its own, I think really moved forward the conversations that have been percolating for years around some sort of set of guidelines that documentary filmmakers can use to use as guardrails to make sure that we're not creating harm, that we're thinking about our own power and privilege, and that we're really doing the introspective work to understand whether or not we should even tell a story, whether it's ours to tell. So the way that work informed, the way that Wesley and I thought about the curatorial statement is that too often, not just in documentary film, but pretty much in every aspect of American life, there are those who are able to lay claim to stories in ways that often do harm and do extract from the communities or the people whose stories are being told. And so we really wanted to lift up examples of films where people from marginalized communities, people that we don't normally hear from, are addressing the idea of artificial intelligence in ways that we may not expect and we may not also recognize. It may not come across as legible in terms of what we think AI is and can be. And so the films that we curated, we really feel are examples of ways of thinking about AI and the implications that it has, not only on our collective world, but certainly on the ways that marginalized communities are impacted, was really important. And so as you see, the films and even Stephanie Jenkins' project all sort of imagine AI in ways that I think are unconventional, that run counter probably to sort of the status quo. And we really wanted to challenge the way that we think about this work in ways that would be generative and also really cause us to think about these questions of who gets to tell the story and whose story is being told and what's the impact.
Thanks so much. Shalini, I would love to, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, this has been such an exciting year in the past year. I have to say, after I initially saw Coded Bias, I immediately joined that Algorithmic Justice League. So getting a sense of what they've been up to has just been so powerful. But I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about how you hope Coded Bias will push the culture forward. And as Natalie just talked about, maybe a little bit, what in the filmmaking process got you and your team the most excited? I mean, I think part of what resonated with me so much in what Natalie just said is I would love to hear more about sort of the inside of the filmmaking process and what you really felt the rest of the culture needs to know.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. It's an incredible honor to be among such brilliant and brave women on this panel. And I think when I set out to make the film, I almost didn't imagine the impact it would have on the culture. I felt very much, as a woman of color, almost like an imposter. And I am a huge fan of working films. And part of what motivates me to make films is that I believe that stories lead to action and they lead to social engagement. And what I also think is interesting that I didn't learn until making the film is that there's always been this dialogue between science fiction filmmakers and AI developers. And I think that filmmakers play a role in shaping the imagination of what these technologies can be, this public imagination about what technologies can be. And I think in the case of Coded Bias, I sought to recenter the voices of women and people of color in that conversation. And also, I think it's important to say that I think Coded Bias is actually very representative of who is leading the fight against bias and for greater ethics in AI. But I think for me, starting out, I felt very much like an imposter and was so worried that I would misuse these terms. And I think my only street cred was that I was a science fiction fanatic. And I sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole when I read a book called Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil. And I think that my background as a sci-fi fanatic did not prepare me for how AI was being used in the now and the ways in which artificial intelligence, algorithms, machine learning is increasingly becoming this gatekeeper of opportunity, deciding really important things about who gets hired, who gets healthcare, how long a prison sentence someone may even serve. And I think at the same time, I was learning the extent to which we as human beings are outsourcing our decision-making to machines. I stumbled upon Joy Buolamwini's TED Talk and read the work of Sophia Moja Noble, Algorithms of Oppression, and Artificial Intelligence by Meredith Broussard, and realized that these same systems that we are trusting so implicitly have not been vetted for racial bias or for gender bias, or even more broadly, that they won't cause harm to people. And that's, I think, when I really began to realize that everything that we love, everything that I love, equal rights, fair housing, the fact that women shouldn't be discriminated in for employment opportunities and credit, or that communities of color shouldn't have undue police scrutiny, that all of these things are being transformed by artificial intelligence. And there was this massive gap in literacy. And we were putting our blind faith in these systems, believing them to be fair and accurate and unbiased. And we could, in fact, roll back 50 years of civil rights advances in the name of trusting these black box algorithms to be neutral when they're not. And I think, making the film was incredibly a vulnerable process. And I learned that the reason that so many of us feel like we don't belong at the table in these circles of power where these conversations are being had. And I think when it comes to AI, all of the knowledge has been in the hands of the few. And so I think all of the power has been in the hands of the few. And what I really hope is that Coded Bias pulls out a chair for all of us and says, we all have a place at the table because these systems are deployed on the world, on all of us, and we have to understand how these systems work. And so I hope that Coded Bias gives us a common language for that moment, like Trinae Moran, the Brooklyn resident in the film, whose landlord is trying to put facial recognition in the building. She articulates it so clearly. We all have this moment where we just feel something's not right here. Something's not fair here. And I think that I hope what the film will do is give us some tools to lean into that and to challenge sort of this opaque, unbridled power of big tech.
Whew, I love that. Pulling out a chair for all of us. Thank you. So Marsha, I'm going to ask you to take that step back with all of us and help us, panelists and audience, put this in a like longer scope of understanding, because a little bit like Miss Moran in Brooklyn, I think when Natalie and I were looking at the top 100 lists for AI films, just to kind of get a sense of the scope of what was out there already. We had seen Shalini's film, but I was trying to get a sense of what she had to work with, what were the other films that were out there. And when we first just looked up top 100 lists, we literally saw Wikipedia had a list of 100 top AI films, and to a person, they were all directed by white men. And at first we thought it was kind of a joke, but it wasn't. So we started digging deeper. And so I just wanted to ask you to give us a little bit of history here about the background of AI films.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Wesley. Well, as a humanist and a film historian, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how significant and consequential representation is. And this is especially the case when it comes to AI, as Shalini's film makes such an eloquent case for. And as the symposium has been repeatedly affirming, we have to keep asking questions about what AI looks and sounds like, what AI does and for whom, and whose interests AI serves. And these questions are at the core of film representations of AI, which are often expressions of anxiety or fear. Sebastian Lau's presentation a few days ago talked about this as well. But Wendy Chun, who also gave a wonderful keynote at this symposium, mentioned in her keynote that AI encodes and perpetuates discrimination. And I would say, and apropos, Wesley, of how you introduced this question, that in this, AI is following the historical path established by film and media. So in some ways, it's replicating those same biases. And so I think it's important to at least spend a couple minutes talking about some of the canonical, I like Natalie's term conventional. Shalini, you said in the hands of a few, of the few. Precedents for why it's important to have a curatorial program like the two of you put together that makes space for other voices to be heard. And I think it's really interesting when you start looking back at some of these films. For example, the ur-text of all sci-fi film made in Germany 100 years ago in 1927, almost 100 years ago, Metropolis, directed by Fritz Lang, which is about a robotic replica of a woman, and I think should be said, white skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, created by a male scientist to harm not just a community, but a poor, oppressed community of laborers. who in the end is burnt at the stake. But, and I realized that the robot Maria is not AI, for all of you out there going, that's not AI, but it is imagining the creation of an entity that can pass as human. It's difficult to tell the difference between human and robot. And it's an early example of a film that is about people who can afford to create technology and use it. What they do is they use it for oppressive, exploitative purposes. So I think in that way, a film like Metropolis really bears on the conversations we're having today. I think, not to mention, at least very briefly, Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film 2001 would be erroneous in terms of the kind of setting up the texts that inform again, the reactions to in media, film and media that we're talking about today. And this is of course, a male-voiced, it's not an embodied entity on the screen, but it's a male-voiced computer that asserts its will over this space mission and is eventually kind of pulled out of service, peters out in the end when its own will kind of becomes a horror character over the course of the film. In Ridley Scott's Blade Runner from 1982, just jumping around a bit, this is about corporate controlled and produced replicants, which are like intelligent robots, hard to tell the difference between them and people, begin to assert their own right and their will to live beyond what they are programmed to do. We see versions of this in some of the curated programming that you all put together in terms of the idea of resistance. And I think Shalani's film is very much a documentary about resistance, putting that in the hands, especially of women and people of color, at least being at the vanguard. But what's interesting to me about Blade Runner in relationship to that idea is it's not about an individual. It's not about Maria the robot and Metropolis. It's not about a computer system. It's about a whole class or race, however you want to put it, of people that are being used in this way. And in that way, I think it's pretty resonant with what's happening now with AI. And the final film I'll mention is one of the ones that was available as part of the symposium, and that's Her. And I want to spend a little bit more time talking about Her. This is the Spike Jonze film from 2013, which literalizes the idea that we are seduced by our technology by telling the story of an AI operating system voiced by Scarlett Johansson. Blonde hair, green eyes, by the way. We don't see her on screen once, but as you're watching the film, as I'm watching the film, I should say, it's really hard for me not to imagine her. And I think it's one of the clever things that they do in this film, they disembody her, and yet we can all picture her because we know who Scarlett Johansson, the movie star, is. And as I rewatched it this week, I kept thinking, well, what if instead of Scarlett Johansson, they used the voice of HAL 9000 from 2001, saying the lines that she says? And I think we can agree that Theodore would have immediately turned off that OS pretty early in the film and not responded to it, right? It becomes a horror film that way. And instead, this is a feminine, seductive character who's also very realist. There's nothing really artificial about her voice and her laugh and her feelings. And so she literally seduces her way into the life and bed of this lonely man by fulfilling all of his needs. She's friend and therapist, work assistant, lover, even as she starts to have her own needs that she expresses and that she demands. And so while you're watching that film, I think it's very hard not to think of her as a person, as a woman. And the twist is that she ends up evolving and leaving Theodore at the end, and he's as lonely as he was in the beginning. But it's, I think, important to say that Samantha is not a robot. She's not a monster. She's much more banal, and I think more horrifying, in part because of the way the other characters in the film, and maybe even most of us watching it, accept the role that she plays in Theodore's life. And I think that's the cleverness of the film, because that is a more alarming representation of AI to me than any of these. And the last thing I want to say is that I was really struck by a question that was asked of Chetan Dubey after his keynote for this symposium about why he chose to make IP Soft's Amelia a blonde-haired and blue-eyed woman, which is why I kept mentioning that, which his answer was that, that they wanted to model the AI after a real person. He basically said, we did this for the sake of realism. But of course, that does not negate the fact that they chose a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman to model the technology on. And so I think this all comes full circle back to representation and that idea of the importance of what AI looks and sounds like and in whose service it is.
Thanks so much, Marsha. So before, I have one more question for the panel before we open it up to the audience, but you all just put so much on the table. I just want to see if you all want to respond to one another.
Well, I just want to say how exciting it was for Marsha to give that science fiction history and to frame it that way, because I've had so many conversations about how I've never fantasized about having an affair with my AI. Like, it's just not, I just don't think it's very like innate in the feminist imagination. And what is so interesting to me is that I didn't realize, I think I mentioned, I didn't realize in making this film that there was always this dialogue between science fiction sort of writers and filmmakers and AI developers. And that Marvin Minsky, who wrote who used to run MIT's artificial intelligence lab, was in touch with Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001, Stanley Kubrick's. And I sort of draw from all of those kinds of elements. And I think both imaginations have been sort of dominated by men in this particular way. And now we have an industry of AI researchers that is less than 14% women, which is abysmal. And I hope will be cause for like a big national investment in women in STEM. But it's actually my hope that, you know, by recentering the voices of women and people of color, and I think I've now had literally hundreds of conversations with people across the country about AI that are almost exclusively women. And I think by doing that, we unleash this imagination, because I think there's been a stunning lack of imagination about how these technologies can be used and used in the public good and for all of these other things. And I think that our imaginations are so part of rewriting the future. And so anyway, I was riveted because all of those films have played such a big role in my thinking and development and imagination myself.
Yeah, I just wanted to like say here also for the background on sci-fi, because I think that you know, when I think about the Black baptism, it reads as a sci-fi film, right? But I think it again, it challenges. I think we have to really open up our brains to move away from, you know, these rigid sort of definitions of what AI can be, and to realize that those definitions really only work within the status quo, right? So when you go beyond the status quo, when you start thinking about how marginalized communities are thinking about technology, and using their imagination, especially Black communities, where, you know, Afrofuturism is so much a part of just envisioning what the future can look like. It's not necessarily going to look like what we think AI is supposed to look like. It's not going to look like her. Her is a very specific experience, as is, you know, even Metropolis, right? There are all these ways that AI has evolved, and I think it will continue to evolve if we can include a more a broader way of thinking about what it can look like. And certainly, I think that's a part of what you know, the curation of these films was hoping to achieve. That we would challenge the margins, right? That we would push the envelope on what we see as a culture is possible, but also really, to use Shalini's phrase, lean into the possibility. What does it look like if someone who we typically don't hear from, you know, for a variety of reasons, gets to participate in this conversation? How does that change the way that we see AI? And I just want to I was really so taken with Dirty Computer, and I just want to say that I have to lift up what Janelle Monáe I think is doing, because I think she's like the ultimate expression of this, you know, not only gender bending, but technology bending, the way that she is envisioning what is possible, and also interpreting what AI not only looks like, but how it impacts those of us who don't typically have a seat at the table. She sees it as censorship, as erasure, and I'm talking about AI, as authoritarian dictation. This is what I see in Dirty Computer. It's an explicit celebration of all things Black, feminist, and femme, which is completely, in many ways, countercultural to what we want to say AI can be. But I think Janelle Monáe is making the argument that we are all computers and considered dirty, essentially, the more marginalized we are, or the farther away from the status quo that we dwell. And so from that perspective, I think that I hope that that helps us to see that we can't really afford to think about AI in traditional terms, that we have to be open to the ways that it can be more reflective of the democracy we say we want to have, and more inclusive of all the voices that are going to be impacted ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add, I mean, I agree. I thought Dirty Computer was wonderful. I had not seen it until we were preparing for this event. And I think it's interesting the way that it and Black baptism and coded bias, I mean, these are all they're such different kinds of filmmaking. They come from such different places. They have such different budgets. They have such different scopes. And yet they are all telling the same stories about resistance and about self-reliance and about having to kind of to intervene in order to stop the surveillance state and the state of control and authoritarian control that Natalie, you mentioned. And I kind of wanted to ask, since you opened it up, Wesley, for us to ask questions, Natalie, I was so interested in Stephanie Jenkins' work, and I was thinking about using the idea of asking questions. I was really interested in the way she uses that as the mode of interfacing with her AI, because obviously there's so many different kinds of questions, right? There's like social questions at a cocktail party. There's interview questions. There's interrogation questions. And so I was just wondering what you made of using that mode of interacting with AI as part of the strategy for opening up space for other modes of AI and other people being at the table.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the question, because I think it relates kind of to a comment that someone in the audience made. I'm just going to read the last part of it, which is that there are basically the comment lifts up an episode of The Outer Limits that features android women infiltrating the family, competing to dominate the husband. And the commenter says that there are other sci-fi takes on AI, not sympathetic to Silicon Valley or the AI technocrats. Furthermore, AI is a tool of class genocide, and putting women and minorities in leading positions will not inherently change that. It's not just about diversity. I agree that AI is not just about diversity. We have to go much deeper than that. Diversity is like a code word for, thoughts and prayers, essentially. It's the same type of thing that doesn't really get us to a solution. I think that interrogation is the beginning of being able to really identify what needs to be dismantled, if not abolished. And so what Stephanie Jenkins is doing is, I believe she says in one of the videos on her website that she's really curious about, she's really tinkering with what AI can do. And I think questioning and interrogating and inquiring helps to just drill down to what is really at the heart of what we're dealing with. So I feel like, especially since Stephanie Jenkins is thinking about slavery, right? Which is something I think that we, in spite of our best efforts, we as a culture, we avoid history. We really avoid engaging with history. And I think she's really trying to push us to think about the beginnings of American history in ways that are going to help us to uncover some of the answers that I think are really present if we would just look at the evidence, right? The evidence that helps us to understand why we have the systems that we have in place and how they impact all of us, not just marginalized communities. We have the answers, but we don't always ask the questions. So I think that's a part of what Stephanie Jenkins is modeling for us.
It's so great that you say that, because I'm thinking of the end of the recent doc, MLK FBI, where the historian Donna Murch makes a comment about how difficult it is for white Americans, for many white Americans, to look at the nation's history and face the narratives of its truth, right? It's just difficult to look for many of us who are white Americans at the actual narrative truths. And until that's not the case, she says, we're going to continue to have FBI agents and institutions like the FBI that continue to replicate the same problem.
And sorry, it's Stephanie Jenkins, not Jenkins. Apologies.
But it also reminds me of the question that came right before that, what Natalie's saying about, to whom does history belong? Right? Because for a long time, the people who've been historians are, overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. So kind of the cultural archives and writers. Mm-hmm. So we're just starting to see that open up in the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm. I actually have a question for Shalini, if you don't mind. I mean, since the audience of this symposium are, primarily educators at all levels, I wonder if there are things that you think, in the wake of having learned so much about this subject from making this film, and I'm assuming probably a lot more since you've made the film. My guess is you could make a sequel like tomorrow and have plenty of material. Are there things that we can be doing in our research and teaching of the subject of AI and media and all the things that you think are like the most important things for us to be taking to our students, to get them to think about the world that they are inhabiting and the ways they need to resist going forward?
I so appreciate the question, because I really think that when a 10-year-old starts using a smartphone, they should start understanding what's happening to their data, why they're being served up this ad and I'm being served up that ad, and that these kind of profiles are being built about us, and that Google is not the encyclopedia, it's like an advertising platform. I have to say, in my own research, I was astounded when you pull back the curtain, because I feel so grateful to sort of the brilliant and cast of my film for schooling me, because until then, I had no way of discerning what was actual data science and what was baloney, bogus, pseudoscience, a bag of tricks being sold by a company. And I can now look at something like, HireVue has these models that are saying we can judge if you're going to be a good candidate based on your facial expressions. And, I can now say that's complete pseudoscience. The evaluation that teaches, like, if Daniel Santos was a good teacher, you could stand 10 feet away from him. I start to ask myself, well, because I've sat with these brilliant women, can an algorithm even judge if a teacher is a good teacher? What are we really saying here? That algorithm in particular was created to judge fertility in bulls, that value-added model. Talk about sci-fi becoming real. And now teachers across the country need to fight against this arbitrary measure that's being imposed by them. These Palantir models that say we know which communities to police. Mm-hmm. I live 10 minutes from Wall Street, and I can now say we don't have actual crime data. We have arrest data, and that's really very different. And if we go back to using these same algorithms and training them, are we just creating this, I think it said in the film, like determinism about the world? And I think when I speak to technologists, they tend to be like, it was just bad data. Like, we're going to just fix it. We're going to clean up the data and somehow wipe history from every past inequality that is so deeply written in all of the data. And I think, to me, it's also just educating about what it can do and what it cannot do. And just that basic understanding of all of those values and perspectives that are being encoded in the data that I didn't understand, because I'm still thinking of like science fiction. I'm still thinking it's big magic. And that's keeping me from seeing how limited it actually is. And I think the other thing is like what Meredith Broussard calls techno-chauvinism, which I think is a great term, which is the idea that a technological solution is always the best one. And I think in the making of this film, I started to think about, what's the purpose of humanity? Is it to go as fast as possible and be as efficient as possible? Or is it actually to create a culture that's based on the inherent dignity of every human being? And if the latter, then the whole narrative has to change. And then, I just want to also respond to that question in the chat too, about inclusion is not always the answer. But when I think about the fact that 3 Black women graduate students found racial bias that somehow IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon missed, that is a hell of an argument that it matters. And considering the fact that this was a technology that was not on a shelf being beta tested somewhere. This was technology that was being sold to the FBI, being sold to ICE, our immigration officials, still being sold and deployed oftentimes in secret by our police departments with no one watching. And I think there's so much to learn. There's so much to learn about data. And I think, I also just want to say that it's often talked about in terms of privacy, data rights, and it's a word that I never quite had an emotional connection with. And I think the word is invasive surveillance. It's like the idea that we as democracies are picking up the tools of authoritarian states, and that these machines create psychological profiles about us that can target us at the moment that we're vulnerable, like at the moment our blood sugar is low and we're diabetic, but it's pushing potato chips in front of us. And that is a lot of power. And I don't think we've grappled with that invisible power. And the other thing I want to say in regards to that question, that it's not just about inclusion and diversity, is you're right, because I think some of it is this economic model of surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff's word, surveillance capitalism. And I worked on climate change before this. I made a film about solar. And I think that I would liken running an economy off of surveillance capitalism to running it off of dirty fossil fuel, just extractive, exploitative, non-sustainable, in a democratic culture, bad for our health and safety, all of that, those things. And so I really, we have this incredible, powerful tool that is transforming everything. And we haven't thought of the out of the box, except for like knowing that your favorite color is yellow, and I'm going to market to you yellow shoes when I know you're not feeling good about yourself, And I think that this technology can be used for so much more. And it's my hope that we can unleash like this new imagination, partly by inclusion, partly by changing the business model, partly by knowing these basic terms of what it can and can't do. Because I think that understanding it through film, I think, is the way I've understood so much about the world, is a powerful way. And the other thing I just want to share as teachers is that AI is often talked about with no people in it. Like Eli Pariser tweeted, like, I've gone to so many future of technology conferences, but none that are future of humanity. And I thought that was so great. And I hope that in the teaching of AI, that we include the people, that we include people's narratives and stories. And I think that's why films are so important because they're empathy machines, that when you empathize with someone radically different than you care. And so I hope it's that kind of personal storytelling that will make its way into teaching as well.
I love that comment. And let me just say, I think one of the things you do so marvelously in your documentaries, I can't remember the woman's name in the New York apartment building who leads the resistance movement, but that you start with like the MIT expert, and then you kind of telescope out to like governmental problematics in the UK and in the US. And then you bring it back down to like a person in an apartment building, helping to organize other people who want to take this on. And so it is about the human stories, because we are agents of our own destinies. And we sometimes forget that when we are passively, submitting to all of these things. So I think it's one of the aspects of your documentary structure that's so compelling, is that you model the behavior for those of us interested in, in trying to be agents of our own futures with AI.
I just want to add, I'm sorry, Wesley.
No, go ahead, Nat.
I just wanted to add that, I think there's so much that Shalini said, and Marsha just pointed to it in her, what she said about coded bias. I think that we, at the end of the day, I think coded bias in particular, but also Dirty Computer and the work of Stephanie Dinkins and the Black baptism are all pointing to the fact that there is not equality. Like we are not at a point where we can sort of, I think coded bias points to this very compellingly. We're not at the point where we can say, oh, okay, this technology is neutral, right? Because we're not neutral. Our history has not been neutral. We have not really addressed the ways that inequity is baked into American history and culture. And that to me seems like, the work, like if I were ever to attempt to do a film about AI, I think that's where I would want to start, is trying to understand or lift up rather the ways that we have to recognize where we are as a culture before we can begin to think that we can move forward with this type of technology in a way that's not going to be extractive, that's not going to be harmful. We're just not there yet. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I really like the question that came from someone asking, can we imagine AI evolving to the extent that it can produce independent AI filmmakers? And if so, what values might such AI filmmakers espouse? And I would submit that, thinking about the core values at the heart of accountable, equitable and ethical storytelling is where you begin. And, to Shalini's point about, how do we teach this type of technology? I think that has to be a part of where we start as well. We have to understand the ways that there is not a level playing field. Like we have to just deal with that. We have to reckon with that. We have to admit it and then go from there. And then I think we have a lens through which we can really think about the possibilities if we're honest about where we are currently.
Thank you so much for that, Nat. I think tying it together with a frank recognition of where we are as a culture, and then bringing that to teaching is such a hard reality, but it is such an obvious step, right? I mean, it's such an obvious step, but it's such a hard thing to do. So I just want to lift up what you just said and say, we need to do it. And I don't know how to do it, but it's essential. So one thing I wanted to just do as a time check, we've got about 10 minutes left in the panel. And to pull out, maybe ask everybody to take on the panel to take a look at the chat. We've had some comments and questions come in. And and see if there are things people want to address. I want to appreciate and thank the audience for submitting a lot of really thoughtful questions and comments. I want to ask Shalini to follow up on something that you said in that last set of comments. I'm interested in comparing surveillance capitalism to running an economy off of fossil fuel, especially given Catching the Sun, which I was such a fan of. So, like, truth be told, my husband is somebody who teaches the history of the environment, and it's head-on collision with capitalism. So he was super excited and teaches that film all the time. But talking about AI as if there are no people in it, and the absolute centrality of including people with all of our faults and foibles, as well as our strength and creativity. I just want to echo what Marsha said about how beautifully the film does that, and also raise a question. So I think it's so hard to figure out how to balance the individuals that you allow us to see in their complexity in the film with the absolute mind-numbing power that you described a little bit earlier in the hour that AI has on a global scale to control huge systems that have such massive power. And I think you give us a common language with the film that is just so powerful. And that's why PBS and Netflix and these huge conglomerates themselves want to actually give us that shared language, because on some level they know that it's scary, because like our lawmakers in the EU and the US don't even know how to speak that language. So you're sort of giving people the tools to start to reckon with what these companies and governments have started to create, so that we can legislate and protect people a little bit, the mammoth nature of them. So I just wonder, when you were reckoning with this narrative in the editing room, can you talk a little bit about that process, the massive scale versus the individual story?
Oh, yeah, I couldn't talk to people for 2 years. I was so scared people would ask me what I was like working on. And I would like kind of scratch my head and be like, I'm making a film about racist robots. And it was just it was very difficult to describe. And I think the cast of the film are some of the most brilliant people I've ever sat with, and taking their PhD thesis and trying to, just as a responsible science communicator, distill that science while holding the integrity of it, and somehow boil someone's PhD thesis down to two or 3 minutes that's somehow emotional, drives a point home, is cinematic, and has some visuals. That part was really very challenging. And I think you see me kind of pulling from the tropes of science fiction to help us understand some of the same visual language, to help us understand those things. And then, the other part was connecting it to the stories of people who had the most at stake, and also not wanting to, I just want to say that, like, I am very much a Black turtleneck wearing New Yorker, but I believe that part of the reasons I make documentaries is that it reminds me that everyday people change the world, and that everyone, all the superheroes in the world are not always wearing capes among us. And I think that's the story of coded bias, that even though it's incredibly terrifying to some extent when you sort of go down the rabbit hole and sort of pull away the curtain of these technologies, it was really important for me to connect with people who are not just hurt by the technologies, but some stories where people successfully challenge the technology. What is amazing to me with someone like Trinae Moran and Icy Mae Downs, these Brooklyn residents who challenged their landlord from installing this technology, is not only did they keep their landlord from installing this kind of racially biased invasive surveillance tech, but they also they also inspired the first legislation in the state of New York that would help other residents from doing the same. And the same with that teacher who rallied with his teachers union. And now other teachers around the country are using that legal decision as an ethical stance. And so to me, the real basic of this is education, and that we don't leave our emotional intelligence behind. I feel like in a lot of these, and maybe emotional intelligence isn't even the word, because I think that to me, it's also pulling back the curtain is, can something be intelligent that doesn't have morals and ethics and compassion? And I don't think it can be. And that means that human beings have to have some sort of oversight of how these systems work. And so I think that the people that inspired me most were the kind of everyday stories and trying to root the film in that, because I think people don't care about issues, people care about people. And the more that you can create stories where you engage with someone, ideally someone radically different than you, because that's where the social change really happens, is when you have that identification with someone who is so different than you. And I think that experience is something that Roger Ebert calls films as empathy machines, that they are in the process of creating this kind of radical empathy. And I hope that's what the film does.
Thank you so much. So do you all have any comments or questions that you want to respond to in the last few minutes?
I do. There's a comment that I'd like to respond to, but Marsha, if you
no, go ahead.
see anything. Well, there's a comment, that I find really interesting. The commenter said there's obviously selection bias in who ascends to what level in society, which means that white males who don't get with the program will be excluded later on, but eventually excluded. And I'm not sure if one of those excluded should be included, but I guess the thing that comment makes me think about is, what I think is at the heart of a lot of what we see in our culture in general, which is a fear of exclusion by those who hold power and privilege. That there is a fear that if we open up the table, the opportunities, the ability to contribute in meaningful ways to conversations that affect us all, that somehow by shifting that power or even ceding that power, that power is taken away, we lose it all, and I think that that's not quite how things work. And I absolutely believe, in part because of what I teach at NC State, which is women's and gender studies, that there's a way that when we take care of the most marginalized, all of us win. It's not about exclusion. It's about making sure that the things that we come up with are not extractive, because that extraction doesn't only affect those who are marginalized, those who maybe we think are expendable, but it also eventually impacts the most powerful. It's not sustainable, as Shalini said earlier. So I think that we, as we imagine what AI can be, as we think about the possibilities, we also have to be open to the work that maybe we have to do to stop being fearful of what we're going to lose if we allow for other voices to be a part of this conversation. It's really not about taking from, it's really about opening up the future for all of us. What does that look like, and how can we all participate?
I'm gonna leave it on that. That's the epistemology I want to point towards. Natalie Bullock Brown, Shalini Kantayya, Marsha Gordon, thank you so much for being with me today on this panel. It has been an absolute honor. Thank you, NHC, for having us. Thank you so much to the audience for being with us. Thank you, Joel and Jason, for being our tech support.
Thank you.
Thank you.